You'd think, after 74 Christmas mornings, I'd know exactly what to expect. But that year, I learned even the warmest traditions can hide the coldest intentions, and the people you've loved the longest can surprise you in ways that take your breath away. My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm 74 years old, a widow of nearly 12 years, and I live in the same brick house my late husband Daniel and I bought when we were barely in our 30s. Back then, the paint was peeling, the roof leaked every time it rained, and the heating system was as moody as a cat in a thunderstorm. But it was ours. Every nail, every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn window, they all hold our history. I've raised my children here, hosted birthdays in the backyard, planted a small row of roses along the front fence that somehow survived every harsh winter. When Daniel passed, I thought about selling, but the idea of letting strangers live where we'd built our life felt like tearing a chapter out of my own book. So I stayed. Christmas in my house has always been sacred, not in the overly fancy magazine spread way, but in the real, lived-in, warm way. The kind where the smell of cinnamon rolls hits you before you're even through the door, where the tablecloth is the same red and white one from the 80s with a stubborn wine stain no one talks about, and where family doesn't knock, they just walk in. My daughter, Lorna, has been in charge of Christmas brunch for the past 5 years. It started as her way of giving me a break, though over time it became clear she liked having things her way. She'd bring the quiches, the fancy coffee machine, and the kind of decorations that look like they belong in a designer catalogue. I didn't mind, it was still family, still laughter, still the clink of glasses and the chatter of 3 generations in one room. But this year felt different. There was a certain sharpness under the sweetness, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It started even before brunch. Lorna had called me 3 times in the week leading up to it, reminding me to just let her handle everything and not to overdo myself. When I offered to make my cranberry orange bread a tradition for decades, she said, "Why don't you just rest this year, Mum?" Rest? I've been making that bread since before she was born. But I let it go. The morning of Christmas, I put on my best emerald green sweater, the one Daniel always said brought out my eyes, and the gold pendant he gave me on our 40th anniversary. My grandson, Noah, was picking me up. At 21, he was tall, quiet, and had a way of watching people that reminded me of Daniel. He greeted me with a hug at my front door, his jacket dusted with snow, and we set off. The drive was peaceful. Snow-covered houses rolled past, each one dotted with lights. We didn't talk much, but that's the thing about Noah. His presence is enough. When we arrived, the house was buzzing. Music played softly, kids darted between adults, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with pine. Lorna greeted me with an air kiss, the way she does now, and ushered me to my seat at the head of the table. "You just relax, Mum," she said, setting a mug of coffee in front of me. I should have noticed it then, the way her hand lingered a second too long near my plate, the faint crinkle of paper sliding against porcelain. But I was too busy smiling at the chaos of Christmas morning. It wasn't until Noah sat beside me and glanced down at my plate that I felt something shift. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, then flicked to mine, and in that moment he gave the smallest shake of his head, a gesture so quick it could have been missed entirely. I slid my hand under the plate. My fingers touched folded paper. My daughter leaned in, her voice syrupy and casual. "Just sign it, Mum. It's for taxes." I smiled, tucking the paper into my bag without looking at it. "Of course, dear," I said softly, though inside, a small knot began to form. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, that folded piece of paper would change everything. The thing about family gatherings is that they have a rhythm. There's the first wave of hellos, the shuffle of coats being hung, the clinking of glasses, the clatter from the kitchen. And then, it settles. Conversations find their corners, laughter bubbles up in pockets, and the host in this case, my daughter, floats around making sure everyone sees her doing it all. Lorna was in her element, hair perfectly styled in soft waves, a red sweater dress that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for the month, and that bright, brittle smile she uses when she's performing perfect daughter. She moved from table to kitchen to living room, hugging one cousin, adjusting the garnish on the eggs, correcting her husband's pouring technique for the champagne. I watched her, remembering the little girl who used to wear mismatched socks and always smelled faintly of crayons. Somewhere along the way, she'd traded crayons for control. Noah stayed close to me. He poured my coffee and made sure I had a warm roll. Every so often, he'd glance toward his parents with a wary eye, as if measuring their moods. That boy has always had a good instinct for storms before they break. My other grandkids were playing near the Christmas tree, shaking wrapped boxes and giggling when someone told them to wait until after brunch. The air smelled of cinnamon, maple syrup, and the faint pine from the tree, familiar and comforting, but now threaded with that quiet unease. The paper in my bag felt heavier than it should. I hadn't looked at it yet. I told myself I'd wait until I got home. But Noah's subtle headshake replayed in my mind like a scratched record. Why would he warn me? And why would my daughter need my signature today of all days? Brunch was served buffet style, with Lorna making a small ceremony out of announcing each dish. Smoked salmon frittata, my famous rosemary potatoes, gluten-free pancakes for those of us who are watching our figures, she said with the sideways glance toward her younger sister, who rolled her eyes. I smiled politely, but my appetite was fading. As I filled my plate, Lorna drifted beside me again. "Oh, and Mum," she said lightly. "About that form, if you could sign it before you leave, that would be great. We need to get it filed before year's end, and I know how you can forget things." The laugh she tacked on at the end was sharp around the edges. "I'll take a look," I said. My voice was even, but my grip on the serving spoon tightened. Halfway through the meal, while people were lost in conversation, Lorna leaned over once more. "It's just a tax thing. Transferring the title will make things easier later. You'll still live there, obviously." She didn't look at me as she said it. She was cutting her food with slow, deliberate motions. A cold little seed planted itself in my chest. Transferring the title? That wasn't a small thing. That was the house. My house. I glanced at Noah. He wasn't eating, just pushing potatoes around his plate. He caught my eye and gave the smallest frown, the kind you give when you're watching someone walk toward a hole and they don't see it yet. The rest of brunch passed in a blur. People laughed, glasses clinked. Someone told a story about a disastrous ski trip years ago. On the surface, it was every bit the picture of a happy family Christmas. But under the table, I was folding and refolding my napkin, my mind already building questions, lining up the pieces. After the plates were cleared, gifts were exchanged. I handed out scarves I'd knitted, each one personalized in the recipient's favorite colors. Lorna's was cream, with a deep burgundy stripe. She held it up for everyone to admire, though her eyes flicked to my bag, as if checking the form was still there. By the time Noah drove me home, the weight of that paper in my purse felt like a stone. Snow was falling lightly now, dusting the quiet streets. Neither of us spoke until we reached my driveway. As I unbuckled my seatbelt, Noah said quietly, "Grandma, don't sign it." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain how he knew, but the urgency in his voice was enough. I nodded, my heart thudding. "I won't." Inside, I hung up my coat, made a cup of tea, and finally sat down at the kitchen table. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I pulled the folded sheet from my bag and smoothed it out. My eyes scanned the dense black print. The words hit me like a slap. Quitclaim deed. If I had signed it, the ownership of my home, the very roof over my head, would have been transferred entirely to my daughter and her husband. No conditions. No guarantees. No rights left for me. I set the paper down, with trembling hands. My own daughter had just tried to take my home. On Christmas Day. I sat there for a long time, the steam from my tea curling into the cold air of the kitchen, watching it fade the way old photographs do. My hands rested on the table, one on each side of that single sheet of paper. It looked so harmless, just a few typed paragraphs, but the words were like tiny, sharp hooks meant to reel in everything I'd worked for. A quitclaim deed. I'd heard the term before once, years ago, when Daniel and I helped his aunt transfer a small parcel of land to a cousin. Back then, it was done with hugs, gratitude, and trust. But this was an ambush disguised as family concern. I leaned back, letting my eyes wander to the kitchen window. Outside, the yard lay blanketed in snow, the roses along the fence hidden under soft white mounds. I thought of all the seasons I'd seen from this very spot Daniel in the spring, digging new garden beds, summer barbecues with neighbours, autumn leaves piling in the corners, winter mornings just like this one, when we'd drink coffee together before opening gifts. This house isn't just walls and windows, it's a living scrapbook. Every creak in the floor knows my footsteps. Every nail in the walls remembers the frames it's held our wedding photo, the kids' school portraits, Daniel's fishing trip pictures. To hand it over would be to erase all of that. And for what? Taxes? No, this was something else entirely. I thought of Lorna's voice at the table, sweet, coaxing, with that edge of authority she's been sharpening for years. My daughter has a knack for making her wants sound like everyone's needs. When she was a teenager, it was extra spending money just to go out with friends. In her 20s, it was borrowing my car for a week that turned into months. Over time, I'd let things slide because, well, she's my daughter, and mothers forgive more than they should. But this was different. This wasn't borrowing. This wasn't a favor. This was stealing. The knot in my chest tightened. My mind flashed back to Noah, that quick shake of his head. He knew. He must have overheard something, or maybe he'd seen the papers before. Whatever it was, it meant my suspicions weren't unfounded. I decided to do nothing for now. Nothing outward, at least. If I called Lorna and accused her directly, she'd have explanations ready. She'd talk fast, pile on reassurances, and I'd end up doubting myself. No, I needed facts. Quiet, solid, undeniable facts. After rinsing my mug, I went to the desk in my study and pulled out the big accordion file where I keep important papers. My hands moved with purpose now. I checked the original deed Daniel and I had signed decades ago, still crisp in its plastic sleeve. I found the property tax bills all in my name. The mortgage statement from years ago marked paid in full. Proof. All of it. I placed them in a neat stack, slipped them into a manila envelope, and tucked it back into the locked drawer. My mind was already sketching out next steps. I'd need legal advice, someone I could trust. But even with that decision made, I couldn't shake the sting. My own child. The little girl I'd once carried to bed when she fell asleep in the car. The one who used to slip handmade cards under my plate at breakfast, with lopsided hearts and "I love you, Mummy" in shaky letters. How does that child grow into a woman who would take her mother's home without asking? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house, the tick of the radiator, the settling of the wood, felt louder. I caught myself staring at the shadows on the ceiling, thinking about locks, about papers, about how easily I could have signed without reading. In the early hours, When the first faint light touched the curtains, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to be an easy mark. I've lived through enough storms to know how to brace for one more. And if Lorna thought I'd go quietly, she'd forgotten who raised her. By mid-morning the next day, I'd convinced myself to make the call. Not to accuse, not yet, but to prod gently. People tend to reveal more when they think you're still in the dark. I dialed Lorna's number and sat at my kitchen table, watching the steam rise from my coffee. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright. "Hey, Mum! Did you enjoy yesterday? I told everyone you looked amazing in that sweater." I forced a chuckle. "Thank you, sweetheart. Yes, it was a lovely day. I was going through my bag this morning and found that paper you gave me. I think you might have slipped me the wrong form." There was a pause, quick but telling. "Oh, that? No, it's the right one. It's just a little transfer form, nothing complicated. It's for taxes." I kept my tone light, even. "Transfer form? What am I transferring?" "You're not really transferring anything," she said quickly, that rehearsed speed in her words. "It's just putting the title in our name so we can handle things if anything ever happens to you. You'd still live there, of course. It just makes the paperwork easier for everyone later." I let a beat pass. "I see. Well, I'm not sure I understand all of it. I'd like to take it to someone who can explain it to me." Her voice softened in that way she uses when she thinks I'm being stubborn. "Mum, you don't need to make it complicated. Lawyers just scare people with big words so they can charge fees. This is family. You trust me, don't you?" Ah, there it was. The quiet test. The one where she sets the trap of guilt and waits for me to walk into it. "I do trust you," I said slowly. "But I also like to understand what I'm signing. You know how your father was about that." She sighed, audible even through the phone. "Honestly, Mum, you're making this into more than it is. We're just trying to take some of the burden off you." The burden, my home, my only real asset, my independence, apparently all too heavy for me to carry. "Well," I said after a pause, "let me think about it." "Fine," she said, her tone cooling a few degrees. "But we really should get it done before the year ends. It's for your benefit, you know." I thanked her and ended the call. The moment I hung up, I let out the breath I'd been holding. There was no mistaking it now. She wanted that paper signed, and she wanted it soon, and she didn't want me asking questions. I sat back in my chair and thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I hadn't had that tiny hesitation, if Noah hadn't given me that quick shake of his head, if I'd just signed like she expected, I'd be sitting here now, sipping coffee, believing I still owned my home, while the ink quietly rewrote my future. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to hear her dodge every direct answer, to watch her push me toward blind trust when she knew the truth was in the fine print. I glanced toward the envelope of papers in the locked drawer. Those documents, my deed, my tax bills, they were my shield. But I knew shields alone don't win battles. My mind went to the only person I trusted enough for this kind of advice. Charles Emerson, Daniel's old friend from his factory days. He'd gone into real estate law decades ago and had a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness. Daniel used to say, "If Charles tells you it's raining, check your shoes, because he's probably right." I'd pay Charles a visit, quietly, without telling Lorna or anyone else, and I wouldn't be walking into his office as a confused old woman looking for reassurance. I'd be walking in as a woman who knew the value of her home, her name on the title, and her right to keep it that way. Because if my daughter thought I was too tired or too trusting to fight, she was about to learn otherwise. It was 2 days after that phone call when I heard the knock. Not the brisk, "I'm here to fix something" kind, nor the rapid, "I'm in a hurry" kind. This was a familiar, gentle knock. 2 short taps, a pause, and then one more. I opened the door to find Noah standing there, shoulders dusted with snow, cheeks flushed from the cold. He didn't have that easy smile he usually carried. Instead, his expression was tight, like he'd been rehearsing something in his head all the way here. "Hi, Grandma," he said, stepping inside. He stomped the snow off his boots and glanced over his shoulder before closing the door. I poured us both mugs of Cocoa Noah's with extra marshmallows, the way he's liked it since he was 6, and we settled at the kitchen table. He didn't touch his cup right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on mine. "I need to tell you something," he began. "And I don't want you to tell Mom or Dad I said it." I nodded slowly. "You have my word." He took a breath. "I heard them talking about the house. That paper they gave you. It's not for taxes. They want to get the house in their name now. Dad said, better to do it while she's still too polite to fight it." The words hit me like a cold wind straight through my sweater. They said if it's in their name, they can make decisions about, well, about you, where you live, what happens to the place. They called it planning ahead. His jaw tightened. But it didn't sound like planning. It sounded like taking. I kept my voice steady. "When did you hear this?" "A couple weeks ago," he said. They were in the kitchen talking low, but I came in to grab my backpack and caught part of it. Mum saw me and changed the subject fast. "But last week, I heard them again. Dad said they should have you sign before the new year so you can't change your mind." I sipped my cocoa, though it tasted like nothing now. "I see." Noah's hands wrapped around his cup. "I didn't know what to do. If I told them I heard, they'd flip. And I didn't want to make things worse for you." I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. "You did exactly the right thing. You warned me, and now I can handle it." He shook his head. "Grandma, they're going to push. They think you'll just sign. Like you always go along to keep the peace." The sting in his words wasn't meant for me. It was for them. But still, it was true. I had gone along too many times because arguing felt like tearing a seam you couldn't sew back together. "Not this time," I said quietly. Something in his shoulders eased at that. We talked for another half hour, about nothing and everything. The weather, his classes, the basketball team he was coaching at the rec center. But under all of it was a steady, unspoken truth. We both knew the trust in this family had cracked, and once a crack starts, it spreads. When Noah finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Grandma." "Yes?" "If they ask you about me, about saying anything, you don't have to protect me. I'm not afraid of them, but I am afraid of them hurting you." The lump in my throat made it hard to answer. "I'm going to be fine," I told him. "Better than fine. You'll see." After he left, I sat for a while in the quiet. There was a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't imagining things. My own flesh and blood had set their sights on my home. But another piece of my bloodline, my grandson, was standing guard with me. It's a sad thing, realizing your allies and your adversaries share the same family tree. But it's also motivating. That evening, I called Charles, my late husband's friend, and made an appointment for the next day. If Lorna and her husband were planning to corner me before the year's end, they'd find I'd already built my walls high and locked the gate. Charles's office hadn't changed in 30 years. Same wood-panelled walls, same filing cabinets that looked like they weighed more than a car, same faint smell of pipe tobacco clinging to the air. He rose from behind his desk when I walked in, his frame still solid at 78. "Clara Whitfield," he said, his handshake firm, eyes sharp. "It's been too long, but judging by your voice on the phone, you didn't come for a social visit." I sat, smoothing my skirt. the manila envelope of documents heavy in my lap. You're right. I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me, plain and simple, what it means. Charles adjusted his glasses as I slid the folded paper across the desk. He read it once, then again, slower. By the third pass, his jaw had set into a hard line. Where did you get this? My daughter slid it under my plate at Christmas brunch, said it was for taxes. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something close to anger in them. Clara, this is a quitclaim deed. If you'd signed this, you'd have signed away your legal ownership of your home to your daughter and her husband. Immediately, no payment, no guarantees. And you'd have no right to live there unless they allowed it. I'd braced for bad news, but hearing it in his blunt tone still made my stomach knot. So, if I had signed, you could have been evicted the next day, he said flatly. Now, I'm not saying they'd have done that right away, but legally they'd have had every right. And if they decided to sell or take a loan against it, you'd have no say. You'd be a tenant in your own house at their mercy. I sat back, my hands tightening on the envelope in my lap. She told me it was to make things easier later. Charles gave a humorless laugh. Easier for them, maybe, not for you. Clara, this is textbook elder financial abuse. They were hoping you'd trust them enough not to read it. And if you had... He let the sentence hang. I told him about Noah's warning, about Lorna's evasive phone call. His expression didn't change much, but I saw his pen tap against the desk the way it used to when Daniel and I asked about tricky contract clauses. You did the right thing bringing this here, he said. Now, here's what I want you to do. First, keep that original paper somewhere safe. Don't destroy it. It's evidence of intent. Second, get all your property documents together. Original deed, tax bills, mortgage payoff, anything with your name on it. I want copies of everything. I have them already, I said, sliding the envelope across to him. He flipped through the papers, nodding. Good. Very good. Now, one more thing. Do not tell your daughter you've spoken to me. If she thinks you're suspicious, she might back off for now, but she'll come at you another way later. We want her to think you're still in that polite, trusting phase. It felt strange, conspiring against my own child. But Charles's steady gaze reminded me this wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. I can send her a letter, formally warning her that any attempt to transfer or interfere with your property will be treated as a criminal matter, he said. Sometimes that's enough to make people think twice. And if not, he tapped the folder. We'll be ready. When I left his office, the winter sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snowy parking lot. The air was sharp and cold, but I felt a different kind of chill, the clarity of knowing the exact shape of the danger I was in. Walking to my car, I thought about Daniel. He'd always said, "Don't start a fight you can't win, Clara. But if they start it, you finish it." Well, my daughter had started one, and I was going to finish it my way. I left Charles's office with a plan, and plans are easier to live with than uncertainty. Still, the trick would be making sure Lorna didn't suspect that I had one. Over the next week, I answered her calls the same way I always had. Warm, agreeable, just enough small talk to make her think nothing had changed. When she asked if I'd looked over the paper, I told her, "Not yet, but it's in my bag. I'll get to it." I even threw in a chuckle, like I was the one being forgetful. "Oh, Mom," she'd say with that feigned patience, "I just don't want you to miss the deadline. You know, for the taxes." "I know, dear," I'd reply sweetly. "I'm sure you'll remind me." What I didn't tell her was that Charles had already locked down everything that mattered. The deed was now officially marked with a legal notice that it could not be transferred without my signed, notarized consent. My bank accounts had additional security steps, My will had been updated to remove her from any authority over my property, and Charles had a copy of every relevant document in his office safe. The more relaxed I acted, the bolder she became. On one call, she mentioned wanting to open up the living room, which in my house meant knocking down the wall Daniel and I had put up ourselves 40 years ago. Another time, she joked about how she'd finally have room for that big sectional couch. She never said when these changes would happen, but she didn't have to. I could hear the timeline ticking in her head. It was like watching someone measure your living room for furniture you never agreed to buy. Noah and I kept our conversations brief and careful. He'd stop by with groceries or shovel my walkway after a snowfall, and we'd chat about the weather or his classes, but always with the quiet understanding that we were on the same side. Sometimes he'd just give me a look, one that said, "Don't worry, I'm here." One evening, I sat by the fireplace, knitting a scarf and thinking about how my daughter probably thought she was outmaneuvering me. She had no idea she was the one being watched now. I decided then that I wouldn't just block her attempt. I'd leave her with no path forward at all. But first, I needed her to keep thinking the door was still open. It happened the following Thursday. I was in the middle of making a pot of chicken soup when my phone rang. The number was from my bank. Normally, those calls were about CD renewals or fraud alerts, but the voice on the other end was polite, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Whitfield? This is Diane from First State Bank. I just wanted to confirm, did you authorize your daughter to access your joint safety deposit box today?" My heart gave a small, steady thud. "I don't have a joint box with my daughter," I said. A pause. "Our records show her name was added years ago. She's here now requesting access to, retrieve some documents." The soup simmered unattended while I pulled on my coat. "Please let her know I'll be there in 10 minutes, I told Diane. The branch was warm compared to the icy air outside, but the temperature in my body dropped another 10 degrees when I saw Lorna standing at the counter chatting with the clerk. She looked surprised to see me, though she masked it quickly. "Mum, I was just—" "I know," I said evenly. "You were here for some documents. Why don't we open the box together?" Her eyes darted to the clerk, then back to me. "It's nothing, just some—" "Together," I repeated. The clerk cleared her throat. "Of course. Right this way." We followed her into the small vault room, where she brought out the long metal box. When she set it on the table and stepped aside, I unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside, my original deed, insurance papers, and a handful of personal letters from Daniel. I could almost feel her impatience radiating across the table. "What exactly were you planning to take, Lorna?" I asked. She gave a light laugh. "Oh, Mum, don't be so dramatic. I just thought I could save you a trip, that's all. You shouldn't have to deal with these things." "These things," I said slowly, "are my life's work, and they don't leave my sight." I gathered the papers, slid them into my bag, and locked the box again. Then I turned to the clerk. "I'd like to remove her access immediately." Lorna's eyes widened. "Mum!" But Diane only nodded. "We can take care of that right now." I didn't raise my voice, didn't make a scene. I simply signed the necessary forms, handed over the key, and walked out with my head high. Back in my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. This wasn't just about a form anymore. She was circling every piece of my security, every safeguard Daniel and I had built. She thought she was being clever. She didn't realize she'd just made my case stronger than ever. I knew I needed a moment where the truth would come out in a way that couldn't be spun or brushed off. Something public, but not chaotic, a place where she'd have to face what she'd done with other people listening. New Year's Eve gave me the perfect excuse. Every year since Daniel passed, I've hosted a small dinner for close family. Nothing fancy, just a roast, a few side dishes, and dessert. Lorna had tried to take over the tradition more than once, but I'd held my ground. This year, I called her myself and said warmly, "Let's have dinner here. My treat. I'll handle everything." She sounded surprised, even a little suspicious, but she agreed. I could hear the calculations in her pause. Maybe she thought I was finally slipping back into my old go along to keep the peace ways. Noah knew the truth. He offered to help me set the table, and together we laid out the good china, polished silverware, and fresh linens. Everything was just as it had been when Daniel was alive, a table meant to say, "This is family." The night arrived crisp and clear, glittering under the streetlights as guests trickled in. My younger daughter, her husband, and a couple of cousins filled the air with easy chatter. Lorna and her husband came last, all smiles and compliments. "You've outdone yourself, Mum," she said, kissing my cheek. "See? When you take it easy, things turn out better." I smiled back, not letting the words sting. Not tonight. Dinner began with polite conversation. I kept it flowing, asking questions, listening, laughing when appropriate. All the while, the folded quitclaim deed sat in my sideboard drawer, along with the letter Charles had prepared, a simple, direct warning addressed to Lorna and her husband about the illegality of attempting to coerce a property transfer. When the main course plates were cleared and coffee was poured, I reached for the drawer. My hands were steady. "I almost forgot," I said lightly, drawing the paper out and placing it on the table. "Lorna, dear, I've been meaning to ask you about this form you gave me at Christmas." The conversation around the table dimmed instantly, as if someone had turned down the volume on a radio. She laughed a little too brightly. "Oh, that. Yes, we should really get that signed before the new year," I finished for her, my voice calm but carrying. "Yes, I remember. You said it was for taxes, but when I read it—" I paused, letting my gaze move slowly around the table. "I discovered it was a quitclaim deed, the kind that would have given you full ownership of my home." Silence. Even the clink of spoons against cups stopped. Lorna's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Mum, you're misunderstanding. It was just so we could help manage things if I became incapable," I supplied. "Funny, because that's not what the language here says. It says nothing about helping. It says I'd have no rights to my property the moment I signed, and you neglected to mention that." I laid Charles's letter beside the deed. "I had this reviewed by a lawyer. He tells me that what you attempted is not only dishonest, it could be considered elder financial abuse." Gasps from the cousins. My younger daughter set down her cup sharply. Lorna's husband shifted in his seat. "That's a strong accusation." "It's not an accusation," I said evenly. "It's a fact. You tried to get me to sign a document that would strip me of my home without telling me what it really was. And then last week, Lorna attempted to access my safety deposit box without my knowledge." All eyes turned to her. Her cheeks flushed deep red. "That's not—" she began. "Diane at the bank can confirm," I interrupted. "She watched me remove your access myself." The room was so still I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I folded my hands on the table. "I want you to know I've taken steps. The deed cannot be transferred without my notarized consent. My will has been updated. And should either of you attempt something like this again, the next conversation we have will be in the presence of the police." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at me. I turned to the rest of the table. "I share this because silence is how things like this happen. I will not be silent about someone, even family, trying to take what doesn't belong to them." For a moment, no one spoke. Then my younger daughter, voice tight, said, "Good for you, Mum." A cousin murmured, "Absolutely." Lorna mumbled something about needing air and left the table, her husband following. I didn't stop them. I stayed seated, sipping my coffee. My hands didn't shake. Not once. That night, after everyone had gone, Noah stayed behind to help me clear the table. He didn't say much, just gave me a small nod as he carried dishes to the sink. And in that nod was everything pride, relief, and the unspoken promise that I hadn't fought this alone. 2 days after the dinner, I walked into Charles's office again, this time with a lightness in my step I hadn't felt in weeks. He looked up from his desk and grinned. "Judging by your expression, I'm guessing things went according to plan." I told him everything. How I'd brought out the deed at the dinner table, how I'd read it aloud, how Lorna's face had drained of colour when I mentioned the bank. Charles listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "Good," he said finally. "You've made it very clear that you're not an easy target. Now we finish the job." He slid a stack of papers toward me. "These are official notices removing your daughter and her husband from any position of financial authority over your affairs. No co-signing rights, no emergency management powers, nothing. I'll file them today." I signed each page carefully, the pen steady in my hand. It felt less like writing my name and more like sealing a door that should never have been opened. "Now," he continued, "I've also drafted a letter for them. It outlines exactly what they attempted, makes it clear you're aware of your rights, and warns that any further action will be met with legal consequences. This will go to them by certified mail, so they have to sign for it. I want their acknowledgement in writing." I nodded. "Send it." The letter went out the next morning. Lorna didn't call. She didn't text. There were no messages left on my voicemail. But Noah told me she'd been quieter at home, walking on eggshells around his father, avoiding any talk about me. It was strange, this new silence. Not comfortable, but clean. The kind that comes after a storm, when the debris is still scattered, but the air is finally clear. I knew we wouldn't be close again. Some things, once broken, don't mend the same way. But I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was the idea of being tricked into giving away the one thing Daniel and I had built together, the one constant in my life. By the end of the week, every account, every document, every safeguard was locked tighter than the vault at the bank. I had copies of everything in my desk and in Charles's office. My phone was set to alert me for any unusual activity on my accounts. The final step was purely symbolic, but it mattered to me. I had the locks on my front and back doors changed. Not because I thought she'd try to break in, but because I needed the reminder that I was the one in control of who crossed my threshold. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I stood in my living room for a long moment, turning one over in my palm. It wasn't just a key, it was a promise to myself. The weeks that followed were calmer. I didn't see much of Lorna, and when I did, she was polite, even careful. But the warmth between us had thinned to something almost transparent. I didn't force conversation. I didn't chase. Noah, on the other hand, came by often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just for tea. He never brought up the dinner again, but every so often he'd glance around the house like he was checking to make sure everything was still in its place. I appreciated it more than I could say. On one of his visits, he caught me pruning the rose bushes in the front yard. "You know," he said, "I think Grandpa would be proud of you." I smiled, brushing snow off my gloves. I think he'd tell me it's about time. Life settled into a new rhythm. I went to my book club, baked bread for the church fundraiser, and even started sorting through old boxes in the attic. For the first time in months, I felt like I could plan ahead without the shadow of someone else's agenda creeping in.